Okay, great. So today we are very honored to have Professor Rashaan Wade to do our departmental seminar, and Professor Ray is Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. And he's also currently the David M. Robinson Fellow at the Brookings Institutions. Uh, and above all, of course, that Professor Ray is one of the many great PhD alumni of the great Department of Sociology at Indiana University, Bloomington. And he's right now also a co-editor of Context, is the public sociology journal of the American Sociological Association. And Dr. Ray work that I think many of us are very familiar with, to look at the reproduction of racial and gender inequality with a focus on policing. And his many publications include two books. One is titled How Families Matter, Simply Complicated Intersections of Race, Gender, and Work. And the other one is Race and Ethnic Relation in the 21st Century, History, Theory, Institutions, and Policy. And among many journal articles, and he published in American Journal of Sociology, Science Advanced, Social Science Research, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Du Bois Review, and Annual Review of Public Health. And he's also definitely a very visible and high impact public intellectuals, and writing op-eds for the New York Times, Newsweek, Guardian, Huffington Post, NBC's, um, and many other places. And his research has been cited from all major news outlets. Without further ado, let us welcome Professor Ray, and we very much look forward to your talk today, which is the title of the talk is Bad Apples Come from Rotten Trees in Policing, Pursuing Racial Equity. Thank you.
Oh, Fong, thank you so much. It's so great to be with you all. Um, Oftentimes, right down the road, I live in Prince George's County, where the University of Maryland is. And then, of course, as Ho Fong was saying, I spend a lot of time now in Northwest DC, in Brookings, which is right at DuPont Circle. It's nice to see so many of you, people who I know and people who I don't. Ho Fong is a great friend to Context Magazine, and of course, gave a great shout out to Indiana, which is where I got my PhD at. I see Andy here, who I think has a piece. Andy, I think your piece is coming out this spring, actually. So next month, I think I just saw the copy edits, and to Vesla and everybody else. Emily, I love your background, by the way. I was looking at that as you were talking. But nonetheless, let's get started. I'm definitely open to questions throughout. What I'm going to essentially ask you to do is to put your seatbelts on. I'm going to aim to cover a lot of information in a very short period of time. And considering that we have time for Q&A and discussion afterwards, I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a very kind of vibrant discussion and conversation. So as Ho Fong said, I'm going to be talking about how bad apples come from rotten trees in policing. Right now, we have the Derek Chauvin murder trial for the murder of George Floyd. And it's always interesting because even me making this statement, it's very easy to say the George Floyd murder trial. But it's not the George Floyd murder trial. George Floyd was the one who was killed. It's the Derek Chauvin murder trial. But even that language that we use, the narrative we use, these social scripts that I'll talk about as a trained social psychologist who studies racial inequality and also health disparities in voting, that we know that the past couple of years has simply collided on my work. And it just happened that I needed to do a sabbatical somewhere. And I have little kids, and my wife works in healthcare. She is the lead provider for CVS Health in the DC region. So going away from my sabbatical was not something that I could do. And that's how I landed up at Brookings. I had done some work with them before, and that's kind of the background there. But it happened to be that as I was at Brookings, supposedly writing this book on policing, George Floyd happened. And right before that, COVID-19 happened. And of course, a series of other things that we all know. One of the things that I'll talk about over the next 40 minutes or so is that at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, where I'm the director, we've collected tons of data over the past several years. I'll talk about the myriad of data sets that we've been able to construct. That's one of the things I like to do as a mixed methodologist. I actually got a minor in research methods at IU and went up to ICPSR and took courses. Then I was a TA for courses the following summer. And one of the large data sets that I have, and I just got a grant from the American Public Health Association actually, to look at social media and the way that social media is driving driving either way, either driving division or driving progress. I think both can be true simultaneously. But if you look at this image here, one of the things we did was we collected a large data set from over 30 million tweets on Ferguson, from the time Michael Brown was killed to 1 year later. And this image here was one of the most prominent images on Twitter. If you're like me, when I look at them, besides one being in black and white and one being in color, I can't tell the differences between the years. 50 years apart. And as far as we've supposedly come when it's come to racial progress, we see how far we have yet to actually come. This is the image, and one of the images that has stuck with people over the past few years about law enforcement, the militarization of law enforcement, and how when Black people are not resisting, our Blackness oftentimes exudes a level of threat that even when you are a young woman standing in the middle of the street in a dress, that it takes 2 or 3 police officers to come in a line and pull you out of that street. Because we understand that Blackness isn't simply a threat because we embody it, but oftentimes Blackness is used as a political weapon, either one way or the other. That changes to the status quo oftentimes means that those white supremacists who stormed our nation's capital a few months ago are not able to exercise not only the economic privileges of whiteness, but also the cultural and social privileges of whiteness that Trump in many ways has emboldened them. Oftentimes think about a quote from President Johnson, who said that if you can convince the lowest white man, and he was talking about socioeconomic status, but I think that the quote really highlights the intersections of race, class, and gender about what I say and about what I'm not going to say in this quote. He said, if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the highest white man, if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the highest Black man, you can pick his pockets and he won't know that you were even there. This speaks to some of these intersections, how oftentimes women are just completely left out of the conversation, but also the way that race and class intersect. In policing, this is the type of image that law enforcement would like us to think that always happens. And one thing I know from studying law enforcement is that both of these can be true. So while we can see a police officer on the top right embracing a young Black boy, we also know that just a couple of weeks ago in our region, a 5-year-old was arrested in Montgomery County after he left school. And repeatedly, police officers said that he should be beaten and should be arrested and so forth and so on. Interestingly, those 2 officers that did that are Black. And one of the things I found in my work is that it oftentimes doesn't matter the race of the officer or the gender of the officer. These outcomes proliferate because the organizational structure of policing oftentimes leads to these outcomes. Part of what we know about George Floyd and also the combination of COVID-19 and people being home is that it's presented us with a policy window. The policy space, we talk about a policy window. It's when a social problem comes to the public's attention and a policy solution can be attempted. Of course, the big hurrah, besides oftentimes a lot of the local work, and I've been working with Mayor Brandon Scott in Baltimore and others that I could talk about in the region, but nationally at the federal level, I've also been working with Congress, in particular Congresswoman Karen Bass and Senator Cory Booker and Clyburn and Hakeem Jeffries and others to really push the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which has passed the House of Representatives for the 2nd time. We know that that particular law passed on what would have been Tamir Rice's 18th-year-old birthday, who was the 12-year-old kid in the park in Cleveland. And we know that we've been there before, from ending chattel slavery to ending convict leasing, to dealing with the Great Depression, dealing with civil rights, dealing with marriage equality, and of course, continuing to deal with police brutality, the Me Too movement, gun rights, and the like. that we are in a social movement. This is what it looks like in this moment. And the question becomes oftentimes is what is going to be able to be done in enough speed where things can get done. And we're seeing that at the federal level. I serve on a few congressional committees, and President Joe Biden is not aiming to make some of the slow mistakes that the Obama administration made when he was vice president. I think he realizes he has 2 years with the number of anti-voting laws that are taking shape across the country. So look, I'm going to talk to you about a whole lot of data. I can answer questions about it at the end. I'll talk about it now and then just kind of go through a lot of the theoretical and empirical findings. But I mentioned a large data set on a year in the life in Ferguson using Twitter data. At the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, we also collected ethnographic observational data with implicit bias trainings with 1,200 officers. We went through a cadet recruit class with them. I had research assistants who went out. They were there, like they were going through it continuously. We also conducted hundreds of interviews with police officers. We coded 120. We have like another 150 or so that we haven't finished coding, even though preliminary evidence suggests that the findings hold even with the larger data set. We conducted interviews with civilians and their interactions with law enforcement. And then I think the most innovative thing we have that's second to none is in Laser, we developed a virtual reality decision-making program with computer scientists and grants mostly coming from the private corporate sector. And I'll kind of end with that. So I'm going to aim to cover 7 things. I'm going to kind of brush over the first 3. I think people have layered up with that at this point. I remember presenting this 2 years ago. Even I remember presenting Twitter data 5 years ago, and people were like, why are you studying Twitter? Yeah, now nobody asks me those silly questions. But back then, people did. And so I think for a lot of the early part, I'll be able to brush through, and then I'll talk about some of the main empirical findings. Now, look, for a lot of people, Black Lives Matter started with the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, as his body laid in the street, and they left him there for minutes upon end. Like this is the imagery for Black people in terms of, it's very similar to what Billie Holiday called strange fruit, meaning Black people's bodies hanging from trees. That whether they're hanging from that tree that's behind Michael Brown or in the street, this is the imagery that oftentimes happens for Black people in our local communities. But Black Lives Matter actually started with Trayvon Martin. And once George Zimmerman was not acquitted, or once George Zimmerman was acquitted for supposedly not murdering Trayvon Martin, 3 Black queer women got on Facebook and started talking about how Black lives don't matter. And they eventually came to the point where they said, but Black lives should matter. And that was when the Black Lives Matter movement started. That was in 2012. And for me, I vividly remember that moment because when Trayvon Martin was killed, my youngest son wasn't even a month old. And I was sitting up with a not even 1 month old and a 16-month-old when I was doing my postdoc at Berkeley. And the first thing I was thinking, I was like, oh my gosh, how am I gonna move these babies to Maryland? That was my first thing. Like if anybody's ever moved across the country with babies, you know, you don't recommend that to anybody. It wasn't fun at all. But I also was thinking, what could I do to protect them? Because as a parent, that's what you ultimately want. And one thing we know about the Trayvon Martin incident that most people don't know is that the Homeowners Association paid out $1 million to his family. Now, if we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hand, ask how many people knew that. I'm pretty sure most of you don't. These aren't the kind of things that oftentimes get the publicity. Now we're finally starting to focus on these civilian payouts, which is one of the biggest things that my research suggests we need to focus on. But imagine if you lived in that community. Imagine if your HOA was going to be used for that. Now, I think regardless of what you might think about the incident, you probably have a problem with your HOA money being used to pay for what George Zimmerman did. And I think regardless of people on different political aisles, they feel the exact same way. And obviously we know there are other incidents that we could highlight. There are tons, from Walter Scott to Freddie Gray, of course, but also Corinne Gaines, which you all should probably know well, Baltimore County. Her son was paid out $32 million of a $38 million lawsuit. If you don't know about the Corinne Gaines story, you should, living in the city where you are. Corinne Gaines is on the bottom right. In short, she had been being harassed by police. She had been filming it and live streaming it to Facebook. that came to serve a warrant for her and her boyfriend's failure to appear in court for one of these police stops. After several hours, police busted in. They shoot and kill her and supposedly accidentally shot her son, who was 4 years old at the time. This settlement is probably the largest civilian payout for police misconduct ever. George Floyd gets close, but it still doesn't reach it. Now, if you've been following this case, you know that the money was allocated. Then they said the county didn't have the money. Now, a recent judge ruled that they have to pay it. And that's the crutch of it. I want you all to think about that money in Baltimore. I want you to think about west of Baltimore. I want you to think about where Hopkins sits, and you come out of Hopkins and you go west, and how drastically different heading west is from going east in the city. And imagine if that money was put toward work infrastructure, put toward development, put toward education. But instead, this money is put towards civilian payouts for police misconduct. And guess who has to pay it? You do, if you're a Baltimore resident. Why is that? Because civilian payouts for police misconduct do not come from the police budget, nor do they come from something sensible like a police department insurance policy, like it would be if potentially you lived in a smaller place or if larger cities had a different setup. Instead, these monies come from general funds. And there are other incidents that we could talk about, from Oscar Grant in Oakland, which is where I happened to live when I was doing my postdoc at Berkeley, and the settlement came down and the conviction of the officer within a couple months after living there. So this is just giving you an idea of when I was doing my postdoc at Berkeley, I was examining physical activity, race and class differences in physical activity, because it was a Robert Wood Johnson health policy postdoc, and the Affordable Care Act was being rolled out at that time. So that's when I really started getting into thinking about policy and the way to use research to help inform better decision-making on the policy end. And really the way I think about that is sharing, just like this. When I go meet with policymakers, I share, just like I'm doing now, share the research and help them to make better informed decisions by having the most accurate empirical and theoretical data to consider. And one thing that happened at that point were these shifts in my work, where I had a finding that people are now calling the Ahmaud Arbery effect, but it wasn't called that then, like 8-9 years ago. I found that Black men were significantly less likely to be physically active in predominantly white neighborhoods. And I was trying to figure out why that was. And then, then I just had to think about my experience in Bloomington, then it all makes sense. But in short, it's what you all know, is that it's about criminalization in those spaces. And it's led to some of these particular moments. And of course, we know there are tons of other incidents as well. Of course, we have Breonna Taylor's, but even in Prince George's County, we have William Green, which you all may or may not have heard of. Just recently, an officer shot and killed him while he was sitting in a police car. And Prince George's County paid out a $20 million settlement. Who had to pay that? Me. Came out of my taxpayer money instead of going to education or the like. And I'll kind of get to the way this is set up in a second, but I'll go through some of the other empirical details. One thing that I published an article, it says forthcoming when we publish this piece in Brookings, but it's since been published in Ethnic and Racial Studies. This was last year. We published a paper led by Ali Asasul, and you see the rest of us on the left, where we were looking at what is the impact of people who live in neighborhoods that are over-policed. And what we found was that even when people do not directly experience the police brutality and violence, their health suffers. Men's mental health suffers. They're more likely to be depressed. They're more likely to be anxious. Women's physical health suffers. They're more likely to have diabetes, more likely to be obese, more likely to have high blood pressure. And it's really highlighted in the picture on the right, which is actually Erica Garner. That's Eric Garner's daughter. Eric Garner, of course, I Can't Breathe. That was when that really came up in New York, when he was selling loose cigarettes on the street. And she ended up having a heart attack a couple years after he died because of the stress and strain of trying to make change and dealing with her father's death. Now, when we talk about the criminal justice system, one big thing we know is that Black people are more likely to be stopped by police. Latinos are second. Of course, this is the mean. This is in Minnesota. This should just give you an idea that no matter where you are, we see this. Berkeley, same thing. Interestingly, Black people and white people are actually stopped at higher rates, but Berkeley, they're much more likely to search Black people than all other groups. Right down the road in Oakland, same thing. Stops, significantly different between Black people and all other groups. And then stops and searches, you see the searches follow a similar pattern compared to all other groups. No matter where you are pretty much in the country, we see that pattern. Now, one of the things that people will say is they will say, oh, well, that's because Black people are just more likely to commit crime and more likely to commit violent crime. Not exactly. Black people are more likely to be caught doing certain types of crime. It doesn't mean they're more likely to be doing certain types of crimes. I think one of the best examples are drugs. When you ask people whether or not they do drugs, Black people and white people reported similar rates. In fact, whites reported a slightly higher rate for doing illicit, illegal drugs. That shouldn't be surprising to anybody because drugs cost money. So there's a class component to what you're able to get. And I think one of the best examples is a study in New York City that looked at police stops. Of 700,000 police stops, this was the percentage of stops by race. And just as an aside, when Bloomberg ran for president last year, one of the reasons why he didn't get too far and Senator Elizabeth Warren just shut that down real quickly is because when this report came out, Bloomberg looked at this and said, oh, wow, it seems like white people are being stopped too much, right? That was his classic line. And he was like, maybe Black people need to be stopped more. Well, let's go through this. Of all these stops, 56% of these stops involve frisking. This is the number of times that force was used: Blacks, Latinos, whites. Here goes the kicker. Only 2% of these stops led to the discovery of contraband, a weapon, or a criminal record. Only 6% of these stops resulted in arrest, which was mostly for resisting arrest. You think if you're being stopped for what you think is no reason, then if you resist a little bit, and I think people have seen enough videos now where they realize that Black people resisting sometimes isn't really resisting, or was what we're hearing in the Chauvin trial, which is passive resistance, that Black people's passive resistance is oftentimes viewed as active resistance. So maybe stop and frisk, because I don't know any federal policy or state or city policy we support that's only 2% successful, unless of course it's not about that, unless of course it's about simply policing and enforcement of the people who live there. And I think what I've built up to this point is what I like to describe as a policing hierarchy. And part of when we look at this is that justifiable homicides or police killings is simply the tip of the iceberg. That about half of all police killings are viewed as justifiable homicides, meaning they are justified under law. So the question becomes, what happens to the other half of them? And of course, you see this, that police killings have increased about 25% or more over the past couple of decades. But this is the total number of police killings in the United States. And police killings is the tip of the iceberg and speaks to what I call trickle-down policing. What I've tried to do is build this up to highlight that, yes, we can look at these 1,000 killings where every 20 hours in the United States, police kill someone. Every 40 hours in the US, they kill a Black person. But the trickle-down policing is that thousands of people, oftentimes stopped for no reason, oftentimes harassed and brutalized, and people who are witnessing that, like the people who witnessed George Floyd's murder, are also traumatized. And it leads to traumatic impacts on entire communities and a collective memory of distrust of policing. And of course, the pattern I just showed you flies in the face of violent crime. Violent crime has been going down since the early 90s. And I do think that the 1986 drug bill and the 1994 crime bill did play a role in decreasing crime, but simultaneously played a role in over-policing communities. And, you know, oftentimes that's difficult to grapple with. But one thing we know is that starting in the early 2000s, we started seeing these huge increases in justifiable homicides and police killings. What happened there? Well, there were changes in laws, not only about qualified immunity, because in a lot of states it's been around since the 70s, but it's also about stand your ground laws. And it's also about what is viewed as justifiable. That stand your ground laws really started taking shape about 20 years ago. Florida was one of the leaders. And that allowed a person like us to kill someone and justify it if we felt threatened. Imagine what that allows law enforcement to do. And here goes the kicker as well. Over 90%, if not 95% of the time, police officers are never charged and even less they're convicted. So while people are looking at the Chauvin trial and saying, how would he ever get away with this? Well, he shouldn't, but it's also a rarity even when he is convicted. And it takes video, and it takes a dozen witnesses, and it takes law enforcement turning against their own to potentially get a conviction. And even if you pay attention to this and you're Black or brown in America, you're still nervous about whether or not he's going to get convicted. That speaks to the role that race plays in policing. We also know there are people who say, oh, well, this is about local crime rates. No, it's not. Let me tell you what you're looking at. The orange circles is the police killing rate in a city. You can see the cities at the bottom. They're all over the place. The blue X's is the violent crime rate. You can see they're not mapped onto each other at all. I mean, they're literally all over the place in terms of who's killed and who's not. This is Washington, D.C., for example. Here's Baltimore. I know it's hard to see, but, Baltimore is kind of in the middle toward the lower end. D.C.'s at the lower end. But the whole point is that the violent crime rate isn't related to police killings at all. It's something completely different. And then we have ones that are just off the charts where it's just not. The one that's actually, interestingly, one of the closest is Oakland, and then Phoenix and Seattle. But outside of that, there aren't too many where we see the relationship be really correlated. We also know that police killings, another term for police killings is death due to legal intervention. We also know that these are the different terms that the FBI uses, that the Department of Justice use. I've been, over the past year, I've been helping the FBI sort through making data publicly available. I could talk about those details, but they have a very restrictive rule about making data publicly available based on who turns in this information. And just to give you an idea, the CDC collects information, of course, on what health conditions people have, the flu. Now that we have some, just an administration that really values science, we are now starting to get a really accurate picture of COVID, at least very early on, what we know, and vaccinations are increasing. But the CDC collects all that information. They also collect information on how many people are killed by jellyfish every year, but they don't collect information on how many people are killed by police. It's actually optional for law enforcement to submit this information. Only about 40% of the nearly 20,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States submit this information. Now, sometimes it's because they don't want to, but oftentimes I found, working with dozens of police departments around the country, that it's not exactly the case. It's oftentimes that they simply don't have the resources or the skill set to even collect the information that needs to be submitted. And so when we talk about resources, these are some of the things to think about, that the funding system for policing, which I'll talk about in a second, is warped for what people actually want. I'm going to skip over some of this. I think you all know that. One of the things that people have talked a lot about, one of the things I focused on, and still do a lot, is around implicit bias. I think you all know what implicit bias is. One of the ways I primarily think about implicit bias is about stereotypes. That when oftentimes people have incomplete information, they engage in cognitive dissonance and subjective uncertainty and infer stereotypes on the people to fill that gap. The way I like to think about it is like a bottle of water that only has water filled up halfway. People fill that other half of the water bottle by inferring where that water went. That's what we do with stereotypes. And oftentimes when it comes to Black people, the stereotypes are negative. And stereotypes, oftentimes positive and negative, center around 4 characteristics: how smart people are, how physically gifted people are, people's propensity to commit crime, people's emotional well-being. This has been a center of a lot of my work. Even the piece that I published in AJS with Stephen Foy speaks to this, that paper was like older than my kids were. That paper was literally like my baby. It took forever to get it published, partly because it was so long, and AJS was one of the ideal places because it ended up being just a crazy link, like 25,000 pages or something crazy like that. But what we looked at in that paper was whether commentators in basketball talk differently about players based on skin tone. So, of course, very relevant to what just happened last night and what we've been watching over the past month with March Madness. And, of course, to no surprise, we find that it does. And we did a very, intricate, neat, innovative coding scheme and data collection scheme. And but it speaks to these stereotypes that even on a basketball court, we see these same stereotypes that play out for a Black man standing in the corner. And one of the best articles I think that really highlights this is an article by Walter, who was a social psychologist on the psychology side at Virginia Tech. And what she found was that the same physiological reaction that people have to snakes and spiders is the same physiological reaction that some people have to Black men being in close proximity, say like an elevator, leads to a physiological reaction. And if we just look at the differences in images, just look at this image. Clearly the man behind a police officer is saying this person is a threat. This person has his hand on his gun. He's clearly a threat. What's the police officer doing? Is his hand on his gun? No. He's telling him, pause, calm down. There's another officer on the other side. We can't see his right hand, but he definitely doesn't seem to be in a ready position the way they're trained to be with their weapons. Now imagine if the man holding the gun was Black or Latino. It changes things. And unfortunately, that threat oftentimes becomes justified. To talk about that, look, this is the bottom line. And I'm showing this from 2012, but the pattern still holds today. This is just showing you how far back or how difficult it is to get the FBI data because they don't release it like they should. But one of the last times they released it a lot was what they showed was that this is the percentage by race, Blacks, Latinos, whites. This is the percentage of people killed by police. You see Blacks are the only people disproportionately more likely to be killed. For Latinos, it decreases. For whites, it decreases. Then look at this third line. The third bar is people killed by police when they're not attacking. And the other part of it is when they're not attacking or have a weapon. So they're not attacking, they don't have a weapon. What happens at that point? The racial gap actually increases. So Black people are even more likely to be killed when they're not attacking and don't have a weapon. And interestingly, who says this? This is the 40% of law enforcement agencies that submit the data to the FBI. These are police officers' actual accounts of what they say happened. Now, we collected all these data on Twitter, and we were able to see how people were responding to what was happening in Ferguson, in Baltimore, and the like. We were able to track down to the day. This was a graph showing the number of times the tweet Black Lives Matter was used. We were able to track down to the day when Black Lives Matter became an international social movement. Because again, people had already been doing this work for 2.5 years since Trayvon Martin was dead. But it had, it hadn't caught on outside of certain circles. Instantly, the day after Darren Wilson, who was the officer who killed Michael Brown, was not indicted. Like, he wasn't even indicted. He wasn't even charged for Michael Brown's killing. That day, we saw Black Lives Matter become one of the most used hashtags in the world. But interestingly, everyone still wasn't on board. For most people, it took George Floyd for people to start using Black Lives Matter. And then what I love about this is because the movement for Black Lives has really used social media as a way to organize. When people started using the hashtag Black Lives Matter, their algorithms also changed. And white people started seeing all these videos they had never seen before. Not only about Black people being brutalized, but white people doing the same thing and not being brutalized. See, that's the other part of the equation. That's how stereotypes play out onto people's bodies. It's not only about one person, one group of people being treated worse, it's also about another group of people being treated better, like in that image that I just showed. We were able to track how at this time there were more protests around the country than any other time in American history, up until the Women's March and then up until when George Floyd was killed. And that speaks to us being in a movement. We were also able to track the growth of a hashtag like Black Lives Matter. The time Mike Brown was killed, it was only the 57th most popular hashtag in our data set. Instantly, it shot up to third, right behind the words Michael Brown and Mike Brown. We also know that we could code the themes. I could talk about that. We did a content analysis of a subset of themes. We selected every 100th tweet. The main things that they were able to highlight is Blacks killed with impunity and whites not. Blacks do something, they get killed. Whites do something, oftentimes murder someone, and they're apprehended peacefully. People also talked about displays of activism. And of course, we saw that around the world, from DC to Baltimore to Chicago to New York, even internationally to London and Toronto. But for those of you who study social movements, you know that for every movement, there is a counter narrative, and it's called TCOT. You may or may not have heard of it. If you haven't, it's not surprising, but you know what they've done. They take credit for starting the Tea Party. They take credit for revitalizing the alt-right. If you think about it, nobody really talks about the Tea Party much anymore. Does that mean that they went away? No. They've become intricately tied to the Republican Party. And now you have moderate Republicans being troublesome bedfellows with far-right Republicans and Tea Party Republicans. And that's the reason why it's so difficult, because the Republicans knew that they would lose an entire generation. I think the left is going through the same thing when we look at people who are extremely liberal on the left compared to moderately liberal and what's going on. And we did a word map, and you can see that outside of Black Lives Matter, TCOT was very popular. We had no idea what it was. We were like, that must be a mistake. We don't know what that is. And it actually took us a while to look it up as we were scraping data every day a few years ago. And this is why you should know about TCOT. Because when the Department of Justice report came out, which I think was around March 2015, that handed down a consent decree to the city of Ferguson, TCOT and far-right extremists flooded social media to dilute the impact that that report was going to have. And they were successful. It was the #1 most used hashtag on social media in the context of Ferguson. And they do things like this. They validate justifiable homicides. I could talk about this in it. I don't have much time to get into it. They frame Black Lives Matter as radical terrorists, things that you all already know. And significantly impacts police officers' views of Black Lives Matter. We ask police officers a lot of questions. We ask them what they think about Black Lives Matter. Let me show you what we found. I want you to pay attention to 2 bars. It's a lot of bars here. Pay attention to 2 of them. Pay attention to this gold one. Pay attention to this green one. These are officers who are more experienced. Officers who have at least 7 years of experience or more. Some had 10, 15, 20. The 7 was kind of that threshold. Oftentimes it aligns with people being around 30 years of age, but not always, because there's a lot of officers who go to college, a lot of officers who go to the military. So experience, even though it's highly correlated with age, it is different. What we found was that regardless of race, officers had negative views of Black Lives Matter. This is Black officers. These are white officers. There was one qualitative difference. We found that about 80% of white officers with high levels of experience view Black Lives Matter as radical terrorists. That's what they view them as. What do they say? Look at the top quote. I think Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is a domestic terrorist organization, just like the KKK. I bet you know they are hell-bent on seeing the U.S. burn. Speaks to what police officers think about Black Lives Matter, and it speaks to why when you have a police chief who is appointed by the mayor or the county executive, well, when they do something like kneel with Black Lives Matter, why their officers flip out. Because there's a whole other entity involved with, there's a whole other entity with law enforcement that doesn't get talked about as much, that's starting to, and that's the Fraternal Order of Police. One of the things I know is that oftentimes the FOP president is more powerful than the police chief. Why is that? Because the police chief is appointed by the mayor, whereas the FOP president is voted on by other police officers. Best example of that is Minneapolis, where their FOP president was speaking at Trump rallies during the campaign, and how in Chicago, their FOP president has over 50 filed police misconduct complaints. 50. I want y'all to put that in context. Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd in broad daylight. He has around 20. The FOP president in Chicago has 50 filed complaints. I want you all to think about when you have a grievance, how difficult it is at times to even file a complaint. Have you ever tried to file a police complaint? The fact that people went through that extent to do 50 of them speak to these problems. Look, the only thing I'm gonna say about body-worn cameras, because we're kind of on that and past that. Overwhelmingly, people on the right and the left support it. The big thing I'll say is that you have supporters and skeptics. No one was really against it. You had supporters of body-worn cameras. You had skeptics. The reason why it became kind of a political panacea for politicians is because if you support police, you want to see the video. If you don't support police, you also want to see the video. We're seeing that play out in the Chauvin trial. We saw it yesterday where the defense attorney said the police chief was on the stand and he said, is Derek Chauvin's, he said, is, I think the defendant's knee on George Floyd's neck right now? And the police chief said no. And then during cross-examination, the prosecutor said, besides this 10-second clip right before paramedics came, when they were coming, they had told Chauvin to get off, was his knee on his neck? And the police chief was like, yes. But of course, this is the way this stuff is used right now. I could talk about defund the police. I can come back to that. But the big point here is how much money is being spent on policing. Now, I want you all to think about this. We talked about civilian payouts, but let me tell you how much money we're talking about. First off, this is police spending out of general funds. So in Chicago, y'all are about 26%. I think Mayor Brandon Scott has already cut a little bit of that in line with what we would call defund the police. I can talk about that. And actually, I'll say something about it real quick. I'll wrap up here in about 7 minutes. But you can see across the board where things are. The thing about civilian payouts is over the past 5 years, the largest 20 metropolitan areas in the US have spent over $2 billion on civilian payouts for police misconduct. $2 billion. You know what's spooky about that? That police killings and payouts have actually been greater in suburban and rural areas. We just don't have the data to accurately track it. That's how much money we're talking about. So when Corinne Gaines was paid, when her family was paid, still in the process of getting paid, Freddie Gray's, that $6 million settlement, Laquan McDonald, $6 million in Chicago, that money comes from the general funds on top of the police budget. It doesn't come from the police budget. So what I found in my research is that overwhelmingly, when we're focused on body-worn cameras and implicit bias trainings and all this stuff, police officers are completely absolved due to qualified immunity. And the fact that qualified immunity is oftentimes applied to criminal court in a way that the legislation and the court document is not written, that leads to law enforcement being not part of the process. So what should we do about it? Well, should we reallocate funding, which is in line with defund the police? Yes, we should. I could talk about that. But we should also reinvest and shift. What do I mean by that? Part of what we have to do is we have to make an adjustment to the way the police training is done. One of the things we did was we constructed an implicit bias training with law enforcement. We had them go through implicit association tests. I'm pretty sure you all are familiar with those. What we found honestly shocked me. Not only did I find that police officers overwhelmingly had bias for Black people and weapons. And this is not a mistake down here. I did not mess up the graph when I created it in Excel. Police officers in the group we looked at didn't have any moderate or strong bias for white people with weapons. Even though we know whites are just more likely to own weapons. And when police encounter them, they're actually more likely to have weapons relative to white people. Relative to Black people. In fact, white people are more likely to be shot by police when they do have a weapon. Which was the opposite of the stat that I gave earlier. Interestingly, with this group was a highly diverse group across race and gender, and even education. So this isn't a white officer thing, even though we do find, and there are other studies as well, that do find that white officers possess more anti-Black bias. We do find that, but it still plays out even with Black officers. And the one thing that we think that our research is leading us to preliminarily is that social dominance, when interacting with implicit bias, that's the huge problem. Like some of the officers that stormed the Capitol a few months ago. One of the things we did was we developed a virtual reality decision-making program. We developed over 90 virtual reality scenarios. Now it's well over 100. We have suspicious person scenes. We have pullover scenes. We have scenes that deal with mental health, with physical disabilities. We can vary the escalation to de-escalation. We vary the person who the officers encounter, and we also vary the setting. So imagine this. You put on virtual reality goggles, and when you put on these goggles, you are immersed into a virtual world. And part of being immersed into that virtual world is that you now interact as you would as a police officer. And you're seeing this in the screen. We can track officers' physiology, their heart rate, their stress level, their reaction time, their weapon movement. We can track all those things. We can look at their heart rate. We put their language through a speech, through a stress simulator. And then we also track their weapons with these little sensors like this. And one of the things that we found thus far, again, is that officers exhibit anti-Black bias. That anti-Black bias is directly linked to their treatment of the characters that they interact with. And we're currently preparing this paper for publication right now. So look, what should we do about all the things that I've highlighted? The first big thing is we have to restructure civilian payouts for police misconduct. What do I mean by that? Well, what we have to do is, and I've written about this extensively, we need a police department insurance model that's very much in line with the way healthcare looks. We could also pair that with individual liability insurance for officers. This will lead to insurance companies making them uninsurable to get bad apples out of there. If you have the police department insurance policy, that policy will still be paid out of the police department budget. But as the premium goes up, the municipality should not simply increase the budget to cover it. They should make police officers and police departments shift their funding to cover it. I also think having individual officer liability insurance will shift the way the fraternal order police operates. They will probably start to have some blanket policies for their officers and will start to hold each other accountable. We need bad apple list. One of the things I can talk about as well that's so disheartening, like with Tamir Rice and others, even with George Floyd, is that a lot of the officers who kill people have done it before or really, really hurt people before. And oftentimes they've went to different departments. So in Prince George's County, William Green, who was killed by police, the officer who killed William Green has shot 2 other people before that. But because of qualified immunity, because of FOP guidelines and contracts, police chiefs and municipalities are unable to fire bad officers. Because when they do, they're oftentimes sued when they're not found guilty criminally. And then they have to pay back pay and end up paying out their pension and so forth and so on. We also need representation on police misconduct boards. See, that's something that's been big of late, but if it doesn't look like what Nashville, Tennessee is doing, it's not going to work. With Nashville, Tennessee, they are funded, the Civilian Oversight Board is funded by the city, and they have voting privileges on the misconduct board within the police department. That's the only way it's going to work. If you ever hear a police chief get excited about misconduct boards, that lets you know it has no power at all. It's simply symbolic, because they realize that it's not going to hold them accountable. It's just going to be something to say, oh, the community looked at it and that happened. And then finally, I think we definitely have to think about officer wellness. One of the biggest things that's come out of all these data that we conducted, particularly the qualitative portion, and even this large quantitative data set that we have, is that officers suffer from a very high level of stress, chronic stress, which includes depression and anxiety. 1 in 6 report being suicidal. 1 in 6 report substance abuse. That shouldn't be surprising given what they experienced. It also shouldn't be surprising now after what we saw at the Capitol. Officers committed suicide after that, either because they didn't feel like they did enough, or they felt like that they were complicit, or they feel like that nothing was going to change. Regardless, they took their own lives. Hurt people hurt people. How do you expect them to go out and police a community when they're dealing with their own things? And the final thing is housing. We found that white officers are less likely to live in the neighborhoods where they police compared to Black and Latino officers. That needs to change. If people are being paid by money, oftentimes public servants are required to live within the municipality. Why are police officers exempt? There are so many things that if police officers were simply held accountable like other people, a lot of the things we see would not happen. But I think we have a lot of time to discuss, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. I want to throw things open because I'm sure there are a lot of people that have questions. Everybody has been riveted and not interrupted the talk. And would you like to call on people yourself?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, you can
I can
see,
call on people.
you can see hands and stuff. So
yeah, I can see hands, or people can just shoot, and we'll go from there. Oh, Madeline.
Hi, I have a question. So, I'm definitely someone that is for the defund the police movement, but I was wondering, having housing subsidies as well as mental health services for police officers, that sounds like a wonderful idea. How does that fit in with defund the police? And would that be more like restructuring the budget versus cutting funding?
Great question. Great question. Let me show you what I mean. I'm so glad I got that question first, because I was run out of time. I didn't have time to do the to go through my normal defund the police thing. So I'll take just a couple minutes to do it, and I think it'll make sense. The big thing with defund the police is I wrote this piece, and if you search defund the police, it'll pop up. And one of the things that that I found is that 9 out of 10 calls for service are nonviolent, have nothing to do with violence at all. Police officers oftentimes escalate situations. George Floyd is a really good example. Like, it wasn't just about the counterfeit bill. It was about the fact that the officers pulled a gun on him as he was sitting in his car. That's what set off the issue. We also know that the homicide clearance rate and really the violent crime clearance rate is really, really low. Like 40% of murders go unsolved, 70% of rapes, 70% of robberies, 50% of aggravated assaults. We also know that if you live in a Black or Latino neighborhood, that first responders respond slower to your neighborhood. Those minutes matter. George Floyd is a good example of that. The ER doc said yesterday that for every minute, about 10, it decreases the life. For every minute that a person who is unconscious or unable to breathe does not get resuscitated or CPR, decreases their likelihood of living by 10 to 15%. And then we know federally that spending has increased astronomically on law enforcement. Now, the crime bill did contribute to this quite a bit that I could talk about. And then I talked about that. All right, so this is the big deal with budgets. Let's look at this right here. This is the police department budget compared to other social services in the city of Oakland. Look at how out of whack that is. Now, it's not saying that law enforcement shouldn't get a whole lot of money relative to the size of the department and what they do. But a couple of the things that I've discovered is what they're being asked to do. See, what happens in these meetings, and I've said in these meetings, and some of you all probably have too, where what you hear in these meetings is, oh, we need a social service to start checking for potholes. And people look at the budget line, and the police department will say, we can do that. We're out on patrol anyway. We can cover that. And now they get an extra several $1 million added to their budget for something that we don't want law enforcement doing. They're riding around looking for potholes. Now, granted, we live in the Baltimore-Washington corridor. We need somebody looking for potholes. Like, I don't know about you, but I fell in some potholes. But we don't necessarily want police officers looking for that. So compared to these other things, we see how little is being spent. Within police departments, let's look at Dallas. Field patrol, okay, that makes sense. That's salary the way we think about it. But even these things are also salary. Okay, I want you all to think about this as well. These things are also salary. I want you all to look at how lopsided some of these things are. Police intelligence, these are the people who solve really violent crimes. This is one of the reasons the violent crime rate, the solvable rate is so low. Even though violent crime is decreased, right? I've already said that. Community outreach, recruiting to diversify, special operations, training. I mean, it's very lopsided in terms of the sort of things that are going on. So part of what I'm getting at is that what we must do, we must reallocate, we must reinvest, and we must shift. So what does that mean specifically? Well, let's take Chicago, which has an annual budget for policing of, a couple $2 billion. What would it mean for them to shift or reallocate 3 to 5%? 3 to 5%. I don't know about you, well, maybe not at Hopkins, what I'm about to say, but definitely at Maryland as a state school, we're asked to shift or reallocate 3 to 5% of our budget all the time, oftentimes annually, where they come back and say, hey, we need, and of late, past few years, it's been 5 to 10% of our research accounts have been cut. We have to figure it out. Law enforcement should be asked to do the same thing. The second thing that can happen is a shifting within the budget, where all of a sudden you create a grants program for housing, where you say your first 3 years working on the force, you have to live within the city or county limits, or at least a boundary. Like DC, small geographically, maybe you say within a 10-mile radius of DC or 5-mile radius. Like that gets you pretty far on either end. And like in Prince George's County, where I think maybe around half or less of all the officers live in the county, Prince George's County is 550 square miles. You mean to tell me you can't find a place to live in that county? Like, so part of it is doing the reallocation to invest in social services. And then it's also shifting within the budget to get officers the mental health services they need and setting up a housing structure that also empowers the community. And I don't think that it actually costs a whole lot of money to do, because again, their budgets are already astronomical. We're not talking about cutting 20% of the budget. We're talking about reallocating and shifting oftentimes around 3 to 5% of the budget, which can have a huge impact on another part of social services. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It's been very informative and kind of jarring at times. I mean, especially the qualified immunity pieces and the civilian payouts for police conduct. I mean, it's very, very disturbing things. I'm just curious, how is your, research informing policymakers really to shape changes that we can hope to see in the next few years or decades to come?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I've been meeting quite a bit with law enforcement and actually serve on some advisory committees. So I serve on some congressional committees. I meet with representatives and senators fairly often. I also help inform states and even localities. So I helped Prince George's County and Montgomery County with their recommendations. Pretty much all the recommendations I provided, they included, such as incentivizing officers to live in the area, and also shifting certain traffic calls, which is very much in line with defund the police, shifting traffic calls and mental health calls to other social services to respond, which is in line with what Denver is doing. I think Denver has the best model. The new, also at the state level and the federal level. So I testify quite regularly on legislation. Most recently, I testified and helped put together the Maryland Policing Act, which you all might have read about or saw. It's a package of legislations. I've been working with the state senators that put that together for the past few years, actually, on that. And I testified on a few of those bills and helped inform that. At the federal level, there's a new bill being pushed, actually by Congressman Anthony Brown, who happens to be in our state, on bias in traffic stops. And essentially, this bill is being patterned around the virtual reality program that we created at Laser, that is going to provide funding to higher education institutions to be able to train police departments in their area and around the country. And then finally, the most recent thing is I'm serving on the California State, it's called POST. It's like the California State Training Standards Committee, to look at the entire state of California and the way that they do training and other sorts of things. So, definitely a lot of things happening. I think the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is the big thing, but I also think it's a lot of local and state things happening. I have a new grant with some colleagues at UNC where we're looking at the role that local protests have on local police reform. We're doing that in the major cities, and we're taking some case studies. So definitely a lot of ways to think about the way that our research can help inform policy and the way that these social movements matter. So I don't know who raised their hand first. Let's go Vesla, Andy, and then Ho Fung, and in that order.
Hi, Dr. Ray. Good to see you since the last time. I don't even know when it was.
A couple months ago, I think. Vesla and I do a lot of stuff together.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking about this presentation, but I'm also thinking about your other work that I've seen you present. So I guess I have three quick questions. One is, what are the theoretical implications of the Twitter analysis? Like, what is the big takeaway beyond a kind of descriptive analysis there? Maybe I just missed it.
You said
Second,
on the Twitter stuff?
on the
On the Twitter
Twitter
stuff?
analysis that you
Okay.
presented. Yeah.
Okay.
The second is a bigger kind of open-ended question about, where do you think the research should go around policing? Like, what are the, what do we not yet understand about the relationship and about the effects of policing? You presented a lot of data, but we still have police are still very much a black box, right? We don't actually have very many examples of concrete things, whether it be reducing budgets, training, that improves, not on a kind of individual level, but that improves systemically the relationship between policing and communities, right? And that has led us into certain, I think, rabbit holes that were we to have a more robust research frontier, we would not all be kind of lining up behind. Like, we have a lot of work on implicit bias. We have a lot of work on procedural justice. And, I think that's great, but I think it has sort of sucked the air out of some other arenas where we can understand, for example, the power of the police organizations, right, politically, right, rather than the sort of psychological approach and behavioral approach, I think, to policing. And then finally, what are the findings from the virtual reality study? I just wanted to hear a bit more about what you found there.
Yeah, great questions. And Veselin, these aren't quick questions, but I love them. So first one, theoretical implications for the Twitter stuff. I think it's three main ones. The first big one is Twitter allows us to examine in real time the relationships between collective, social, and personal identities. So oftentimes in the social movements literature, it's overwhelmingly focused on collective identities, the way people collectively come together. But one of the things that's happened with Twitter, and I think that it was already happening even before, we just hadn't been able to capture it in real time, is that collective identities oftentimes can operate as social identities or vice versa. Like, we make the assumptions that a collective identity is what's operating in the space. And some of the work that I've been doing, as well as some of the work of my graduate students in other spaces. For example, just had a student, Amanda Dewey. She's actually the mayor of Berwyn Heights. It's crazy. She's extraordinary. But she just defended her dissertation last week, and I'm her chair. And she's been doing a lot of work on environmentalism and looking at social movements as it relates to environmentalism, finding the same process, that the way people go about their work is really about interrogating and extending the way that the social movements literature is overly focused on collective identities. And instead, social identities and personal identities also come into play, that this isn't simply something that people do. As our social identities, it becomes a part of something that we embody. And oftentimes it's something that's put in people from a very young age that's not captured by social movements, oftentimes because we're looking back in time. We're having to go through archival stuff, whereas methodologically, social media data allows us to do something different, which I still think methodologically and empirically is one of the big things. And then the final thing I'll say theoretically is around intersectionality, that one of the things that we know that happens in social movements, and I think the civil rights movement is probably one of the best examples, is that women, particularly women of color's voices, get pushed to the side. And I think with Black Lives Matter, we've seen that same thing operating. But because of social media, because people are able to circumvent traditional modes of communication, people have been able to highlight the role that women of color have played in the process, particularly Black women throughout this process. So we published a piece in Ethic and Racial Studies. Melissa Brown was one of my former PhDs. She's doing a postdoc at Stanford. She led up this paper. And in short, what we found, we looked at the people who were doing the tweets with the data. And what we found was that Black women, and just women overall, were less likely to be tweeted They were less likely to be interviewed about what they were doing. They were less likely to be put on things like this. So part of it is from an intersectional perspective. When we use the intersectionality framework and we put that on the social media data, yes, we find some similar patterns, but we're able to go much more in depth with the sort of things that are going on. The second question, where should the research go? Look, for me, it's one key question, and you've heard me say this before, is what can we do to stop police killings? Because I think when we stop police killings, we also adjust what I call the trickle-down policing, is that before you get to a police killing, there was a stop. There was oftentimes a frisk. There was oftentimes some bias that loaded up in there. So how do we stop that? So I think where the research should go should address that question, because a lot of the research up to this point has been, as you mentioned, trying to find the data that work, which is how I got to this point. And same way with your work, we just started collecting our own data. Like, it just wasn't available. Like, we have to curate data sets. It's one of the things that I've gotten good at over the past decade, because the data that I need simply are not available. So we have to create those data. We have to make inroads and make connections with police departments that, and I get some flack for that. And I'm like, I don't really care, honestly, because I'm like, how else are we going to get the data if we don't go talk to them, if we don't interact with them? And I think that's been going on for too long. The other thing I'll say is, if we're looking at where research should go, not only police killings, but also follow the money. So the funding is a big thing. And I try to lay that out today, is following the money. And then it's conducting randomized control trials, but not the typical way. Oftentimes qualitative explorations, taking case study dives. For example, the Denver mental health program, which to date has a 0 fatality rate, and I think almost a 0% arrest rate. What are they doing with shifting like 10% of their calls for service that deal with mental health, and nothing has happened? Like, why is that happening? I mean, I think we have a good sense, but empirically, what's going on? Theoretically, what can we do? Albany, for example, in New York, I met with them recently. They're about to aim to implement the police department insurance model. This is an opportunity to get in on the ground level to compare a city that is doing something new. What happens with that process? It's very similar to what happened with in New Jersey, right? With Camden, is that when they what I call abolished their police department and built it anew, what did that process look like to be there qualitatively? And then also, what are the quantitative metrics that we can collect? And then finally, what are the findings from the VR study? So a few main things. First, we find that officers exhibit anti-Black bias with the IATs. We are able, one of the first studies, to link officers' implicit bias to their actual behaviors. And we find that their implicit bias is significantly associated with their actual behaviors. What does that mean? That means they speak more harshly to Black people. They yell at them more. They are more likely to use force on them. And then here goes the kicker, though. There is also an intersectional element where when Black women raise their voices at police officers, they get really upset at that. I mean, they get upset when Black men do it too, but they really get upset when Black women do it. But it's more so that they don't get upset when white women do it. White women just simply aren't a threat. They don't respond. And let me tell you all, to give you all an idea of some of what we did. We took people, we tested their faces. We asked people how old they thought they were, what gender they thought they were, how attractive they thought they were. So we were able to control for what these people look like. And just as an aside, we had 2 people who were just drop dead gorgeous, a man and a woman. And like, it was hundreds of people who rated their faces, and they consistently got over 9s. And we were like, we just can't use them. Like, they're too attractive for the other people. And the other people look good too. Like, they were getting like 7s. Like, that's still pretty good to have hundreds of people rate your face. But that just goes to show you the links that we went there. The other thing that we found is that, and this gets at what I was saying earlier around cognitive dissonance and subjective uncertainty from a theoretical perspective, that example I gave about what fills a water bottle, is officers are filling that water bottle with information. And one of the things we found is that when we increase the unknowns, we put officers in an environment where they got very little information in their calls for service. Because when they put on the goggles, they hear, oh yeah, such and such happened on this street. There's a suspicious person. People think it was a fight. We're unclear what they have on. We're unclear who did it. That type of ambiguity. When they show up, implicit bias goes on steroids. But when we give them more information and they have pretty much all the information as possible, stereotypes reduce. And they're actually more likely to treat Black people more equitably. The problem is that most police encounters don't have information. Oftentimes they're very opaque. And so that's two of the main findings that we have. Three, the how bias links to behavior. That's a big one, and how physiology plays a role. Second is the intersectional finding. And then third, it's how ambiguity operates, right? The ambiguity is a big thing, and that's a big way that things operate. When police officers show up and it says, oh, someone has on a dark sweatshirt. Well, you show up and everybody has on a dark sweatshirt. Who do they think did it? That's when the biases come out. Who's next? Andy?
Rashaan, great to have you take the time to talk with us. Thanks very much. I want to shift from the important questions about academic research to public presentation, advocacy, public policy. I've been impressed with how many very positive suggestions you've come up with today about what we should do about policing, how we should reallocate the funds, how we should have better training, how we should give more money to some of the parts of police work that aren't getting much money so we can get those clearance rates up that are so low, how we can give housing subsidies. All of that costs money, and of course, reallocating that makes sense. Given all that positive stuff, why still use the term defund the police? Why still have a heading that says defund the police? It's a phrase that's very threatening to white voters. It nearly sunk Joe Biden and got Donald Trump reelected again. All of your talk was not about defunding, really. It was about more funding or reallocating or all the wonderful things we could do. Why do we want to keep using the phrase defund the police?
Yeah, really good question. And Andy, of course, you've really interrogated what's going on with white working class voters. When I saw that quote that I said at the beginning about Lyndon Johnson, I was thinking about your article. So I hope that your colleagues read your pieces coming out in context over the next month or so. Which reminds me, we can talk about it later, but hopefully you've got your copy edits and done all, and they.
I did. Right. I'm all set.
I had an editor moment. I was like, hold on, have people done what they're supposed to do? All right, okay.
Done.
All right, okay. So I think about it like this. Defund the police. Imagine if we didn't have it. I always think in absolutes. Imagine if we didn't have it. What do we fill it with? I don't know. Like maybe somebody else comes up with something more creative. But one thing that I know is that potentially without that slogan, that when we talk about social movements, that fits very cleanly on a poster, by the way. The question would be, would we be talking about this? Like when we say reallocating, yeah, it sounds great in a policy space. It sounds great in an academic space. That does nothing on the streets. It does nothing on the barbershops. It does nothing like to push the conversation. And the big thing I've noticed in policy, and Cory Booker says this all the time. I love this quote when I talk to him. He says it all the time. He says, change doesn't happen in Washington. Change comes to Washington. Like defund the police is something that came to Washington. And it's up for policymakers to then negotiate with people's various views on what to do. I think the other big thing is that to be blunt about it, one of the biggest issues, and you know this, that's been plaguing the United States is the fact that white working class voters continuously go against their interests. Because I kind of brushed over this, and I write about this a lot, and in my book I talk about this a lot. Even though Black people and Native Americans in particular are disproportionately more likely to be killed by police, just based on the absolute numbers of white people in the United States, there are more white people killed by police too. And you know what? There are incidents in where an officer is not convicted and there's a large civil settlement. One of the best examples I can give you, I'll try to be really brief, but you all can look it up later. There was a man, his name was Shaver. He's actually from Tennessee, but this happened in Arizona. You all probably remember seeing it on the news. He got killed by police in a hotel room hallway. He was unarmed. He wasn't doing anything. They're currently going through a large civil settlement. This was in Mesa, Arizona, I think. The police officer who killed him was initially fired. Okay. He was then found not guilty criminally. He then sued the department. The department had to hire him back. He then was able to get up to $3 million to support his whatever court proceedings will come at him, because he's no longer a police officer. He also got retirement of $2,500 a month and all of his medical leave. So I tend to think similar to Black Lives Matter, right? It's the same thing people say about Black Lives Matter 6 years ago when people were like, why do we have to say Black Lives Matter? Why can't we say all lives matter or something else? It doesn't get attention. It's the blunt thing. And so I think defund the police is a thing where, like, similar to this talk, yeah, I used it a couple of times and then I was asked a question on it. But like when I get in policy spaces, like that language just isn't used that much. Like it's more of a political lightning rod. And the thing that we see coming out of Washington, and it's happened to me more times than I would like to admit. It kind of blew my mind the first time it happened, but I've been in meetings with Republicans and Democrats at the very high levels who sit and have a cordial conversation and come to some level of agreement. And two things have happened that one that didn't really shock me, but one that did. The main thing, as you probably know, they leave out of that room and stand in front of a microphone and say something polarizing. That was very different from what the conversation we just had. The second thing that's happened, though, is people will be in the middle of a conversation and someone will come in, a lawyer, staffer, whisper in someone's ear, and they will say, before everyone leaves, we need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So I'm sitting in these rooms, I'm sitting at the table, and I know most of us don't have a chance to sit at the table. I definitely know most people who come from where I come from aren't sitting at that table. Trying to explain that to them, and they're like, the police just shouldn't have as much money as they do. Like that's what they say on the street, but the translation is different. So, I mean, that's a long way of saying, I think we wouldn't even be having, I think the conversation wouldn't be as far around police funding, because I've been talking about it for a long time. I don't think the conversation would be as far without the slogan defund the police. That's just kind of what I think. Hold on. Okay, Ho Fung and then Stephanie, because I saw Stephanie in the chat. Sorry, Stephanie, I didn't see that. But Ho Fung, go ahead, and then Stephanie.
Thanks for the very rich and compelling talk. There's a lot of things to think about. I'm particularly intrigued by one of the graphs that you show about the police officers' view on the Black Lives Matter movement. That you show that definitely the race of the police officer has something to play in it. That the white officers more tend to see them as a kind of a radical terrorists. But at the same time that the experienced black officers, which have more than 7 years of experience, also they don't see them as a terrorist, but still negative. So definitely the year that they spend in the police force is also a variable that explains something. So my two quick questions is, one is whether you see the same pattern when it comes to the police officer bias in other situations rather than particularly about the movement. So whether there's kind of more experienced white officers and more experienced black officers are more biased towards black citizens that they encounter. And then other thing is that if the year they spend in the police force has something to do with their bias or their view, that what is it about? Is it about the seniority that supposedly people who spend more time in the police force is more senior, or it is a kind of a socialization process that there's something in the institutional culture of police that white or black, when they are submerged in it for a longer time, does they incorporate those, like the police officers that is charged for the Friday grade, even though the charge are dropped and half of them are black and half of them are at least non-white and half of them are white. So it seems that there's something about race of the police officer and something also about the policing or the police as an institution. So I just want to hear more about how you explain this kind of the time they spend as a variable to determine the bias.
Yeah, really, really good questions and things that I've thought a lot about. I'll start on the last part about experience. Well, I mean, it's both about experience, but the socialization part, like what is experience capturing? I think experience is capturing socialization overall, but what type of socialization? I do think it's capturing years in the force and just how long people have been indoctrinated in this. Like when we were doing, and I should just say as a background, I come from a law enforcement military family. So I personally have some knowledge of what this looks like, but the other people on my research team don't. So to see the things that would shock them, that were honestly commonplace for me, was important, because I was like, oh, okay, that's not something that people just know. Like, okay, maybe it's something about my own biography that shapes that. So the socialization part, there are, I'll put it to you like this. Training is key. Okay, the training they go through. And I know we got a couple more questions, so I'll try to get to this quick. The training part. The other part of it is related to their inability to be off. I have a grad student, her name is Genesis Fuentes. She's phenomenal. And she's examining police identity. And we put some questions on our data set around police identity and really looking at, again, police identity as a social identity rather than just a role identity. Like for us as academics, I think that fits, right? Like, yeah, we're academics, we're professors, that's what we do. But a lot of us really embody being a scholar as part of our social identity. They're intricately tied. And one of the big things that policing, similar to our work, is that they can never turn off. There are a lot of jurisdictions around the country where anytime they go out in public, they have to carry their badge and their gun. Anytime they go out, they could be on call at any given time. How can you ever rest with that? So what does that mean? The other thing is, we know due to laws, they can't share a whole lot of stuff with people. They can't share it with their family. They'll freak them out. They can't share it with friends because there's legalities involved. So who do they talk to? Other officers. Their entire, oftentimes, social network and their social experiences are morphed with policing and law enforcement. And the longer you do that, the more you're ingrained in that culture. Same way with academics we do. For a lot of us, yeah, a lot of us have friends outside the academy, but most of us have really close friends within the academy because we've done it for so long. And so I think that's the first thing. On the bias part, there's research showing, and ours included, that Black officers definitely also have anti-Black bias. But white officers are more likely to have it and have it at a greater magnitude, okay? Now, part of what we think is going on are a couple of things. And this gets back to Vesla's questions about what we don't have. I think we have a lot of the theory. I think we don't have the empirical data oftentimes to speak to it. There are two things that I think are going on. Social dominance is one thing that I mentioned. We have social dominance variables and measures. We're currently going through it. I could tell you preliminarily, there's a very strong relationship between implicit bias and social dominance. In other words, the more social dominance people have, the more biases they're more likely to have. All right. The other thing I think that's going on is that place matters. This is why I'm so big about where officers live. Qualitatively, we found it. We're trying to get at the data around place. There's a new data set that just came out in New York where it's more like public data, and we're just putting it together as a data set, trying to look at place. Because one of the things we also think that's going on is that Black and Latino officers are more likely to live in or closer to Black and Latino neighborhoods because they're from there and just based on the way segregation operates. White officers are less likely to do so. So we think these variables come together to play a role. But the bottom line is that, yes, all officers exhibit bias. And when they have that bias, they treat Black people worse. Now, Black officers are less likely to have it just based on the magnitude, but it still exists. All right, let's get Stephanie and then Rena.
Okay, I just want to interrupt for a second because really we're at the very end of our formal seminar time. And I want to I know people have to leave for classes and talks, and a couple of people have already sort of hopped off the Zoom. So I'm going to stop recording now. And I just want to move. So as long as people want to stick around, we can have conversations, be more informal. But I just want to thank you before we cut off our formal seminar for a great talk and acknowledge that so we don't all drift away. And then we're going to move into a more informal version of our Q&A conversation.
Sounds good.